This podcast has changed my life. I didn't really expect that when I set out to create it. I hoped it would change your life, but changing mine came as a surprise, a most welcome surprise. As 2020 drew to a close, I reflected on some of the lessons that have stuck with me the most from the many amazing conversations I've had with my guests. That reflection uncovered 5 big takeaways for me personally, and I want to share them with you today. To do that, I've dug up specific clips from some of my guests and added a little commentary to tease out the takeaway more fully. It'll be a fun romp down memory lane on the one hand, and a poignant reminder of what matters most on the other. If you've been tuning in regularly, then probably 1 or 2 of my takeaways will be similar to 1 or 2 of yours. But you'll have a few that are different from mine. That's part of the magic and power of story. The same story, penetrating 2 different hearts, can have very different results. If you haven't been tuning in regularly, or are tuning in for the first time, this episode will be a good introduction to what this podcast is all about, a sampler to give you a taste of what the full menu is like. I hope that what you taste will keep you coming back for more. This is Andrew Petty is Dying, where we tap into the power of our mortality to become the people we were made to be and live the lives we were made to live. I'm your host, Andrew Petty, and I'm dying. I hate to say it, but so are you. This time last year, I had a concept, title, and artwork for this podcast. What I didn't yet have, though, was an actual podcast. Plenty of enthusiasm for it, but still no podcast. Then, with the welcome support of my podcast coaches, Tim Wohlberg and Valerie McTavish, of Podcast Performance Coach, and the unwelcome arrival of COVID-19, which took away about half of my usual work volume and left me with more discretionary time than usual, Andrew Petty is Dying launched at long last on April 6, 2020. What a ride it's been since then. As the COVID situation unfolded for all of us, coincidentally, mind you, I began to have conversations with ordinary people like you and me, who've had extraordinary encounters with mortality, and share those stories with you. I think there's inherent value in hearing someone else's story. Among other things, it helps us make more sense of our own story, reminds us of the challenges that are common to all humans drawing breath on planet Earth, and helps us feel a little less alone and maybe even a little less crazy. We connect with another human through their story and the vulnerability it takes to share it, and that connection nourishes our soul on the deepest, most life-giving level. In a year of tremendous disconnection, maybe you've gotten in touch with just how much human connection means to you, or maybe you've actually connected more deeply with others than you have before. Maybe a bit of both. Either way, when you add to the intrinsic value of hearing someone else's story the additional gift of transferable wisdom and lessons gleaned from face-to-face encounters with mortality, you've got a recipe for profound, real-world change for all of us. That is, if you're willing to let someone else's encounter with mortality change your life right now, before you have your own crisis with mortality. Therein lies the key. And therein lies the reason that this podcast exists. On this show, we intentionally keep our mortality in mind, to tap into its power to motivate us to live with guts, gusto, and abandon right now, rather than waiting for the ever-elusive tomorrow. As Aussie and cultural bridge-building finance entrepreneur John O'Bells said in episode 15, too many of us live in the shadows and fail to step out into the full, bright light of our unique purpose in the world. As I've said before, I think that's tragic. Now, without further ado, let's get to my first of 5 big takeaways I'll highlight in this episode, taken in chronological order from earliest to most recent. I'm calling this takeaway, Face the Fear. Episode 6 featured author, skydiver, globetrotter, and life cycle celebrant Lise LaRue, a remarkable woman whose mind-blowing story reads like a sadistic experiment designed by a mad scientist. She lived with a terminal diagnosis for 35 years. For that entire time, expecting her demise was no more than 6 months away. Then, just 5 years ago, her story took an unbelievable turn. I won't spoil it for those of you who haven't listened to our episode yet. Here's Lise sharing what those many years of suffering have taught her about the importance of facing the fear.
Well, I do recommend, everyone's afraid of so many things in your life. If I'm afraid of going outside and walking right now, I'm afraid of speaking in public, I'm afraid of changing jobs because it might be insecure. If I change jobs now, is that a safe option in a difficult circumstance? And if I now believe if you identify fear, you turn and face it. Because I swear, if you run away from something you're afraid of, it turns out to track you. I remember jumping out of airplanes and I was terribly afraid of hitting pointy trees. Pointy trees, for some reason, were the thing that really got me. So what I would do is I would say, avoid pointy tree, avoid pointy tree. And I would jump out and I would look for the pointy tree because I wanted to avoid it. But subconsciously, you are orienting yourself towards the pointy tree.
By giving it that much attention, yeah.
Yes, exactly. So then what I finally learned is, okay, pointy tree, but focus on the direction you're going and face it. So anything that you find that you're afraid of, face it. Maybe don't choose to do anything about it, but face it and say, what exactly am I afraid of if I go speak in public, if I lead a class or a group on something? Well, everyone might think I'm really stupid and that I don't know what I'm talking about, but in 6 months, will that really matter? I think it gives me a really good view of what will I be the proudest of in 6 months. And then maybe the next 6 months, I'll have to rethink what the next 6 months is.
So when we resist the fear and try to get away from it, it's like the fear can smell the fear and it starts tracking you down, huh? And it makes it worse. So face it.
Exactly. And it
Yeah.
starts tapping you on the shoulder. So turn around, say hello,
Yeah.
shake its hand, or not. Don't
Right.
fist bump. Maybe do an elbow bump, but don't avoid it.
I don't know about you, but my knee-jerk reaction when fear shows up is to resist it, try to make it go away, or attempt to ignore it. But those efforts are like Lisa's attempts to avoid the pointy tree. They actually give the fear more power in my life. Lisa's exhortation to turn and face the fear head on, to see it for what it really is, has been a tremendous boost for me this past year. And given what she had to endure to learn that lesson, there's a ton of credibility behind it. What fear do you need to turn and face today? So that's takeaway number 1, face the fear. Now let's move on to takeaway number 2, which I'm calling embrace the mystery. Imagine that you died and came back to life. How would it change the way you lived? Joe Harcel, my guest on episode 11, doesn't have to imagine it. About 3.5 years ago, just a day after getting a great report from his doctor at his annual well check, Joe was walking up the sidewalk to his son's swim meet. A friend said hi, then Joe collapsed headlong, upright and breathing one moment, and prostrate with no measurable vitals the next. For the next 30 minutes, Joe was clinically dead. Then, for no known reason, he came back to life in the back of the ambulance as he was being transported. To this day, why Joe experienced sudden cardiac death and then came suddenly back to life is a huge mystery. Here's Joe sharing how the experience has taught him and his family to embrace the mystery.
I don't completely have this figured out on how to process this. Something that I do stick with, and in fact, probably has come up most pronounced from this, is the idea of embracing mystery. And my family has really grown comfortable with that. And that's not a common thing for people to be comfortable with. I remember I had a grad school professor who said, if something appears to not be true or not be right, it's going to be one of 3 things. It could be a contradiction, which is like A does not equal B. It could be a paradox, which is, things like the way up is down, the way to understand life is to understand death. And then the third option is that it's a mystery. And only the first one, the contradiction, is false. The other 2, they're not false, we just don't understand them, or they don't seem to make sense. And there's especially, again, you mentioned the idea of us coming from a faith tradition. That's a really uncomfortable place, which is funny that it's called a faith tradition that's really uncomfortable with mystery a lot of times. We want to be able to have a clear understanding and an explanation of things. And there's just a lot of things that don't fit that criteria. And we don't know. And through this situation, there's plenty of things we don't understand. And they were mysterious and still are. And we're growing comfortable with that.
Wow, I do not like this idea of mystery in life. Not at face value, anyway. I like certainty, clear cause and effect. In Joe's case, his heart was in better shape than ever, according to medical science's ability to determine, and yet it was his heart that gave out just 24 hours later. And it's still not clear why. That really messes with me, especially given that my particular flavor of anxiety gravitates toward an inordinate fear of catastrophic health events. But Joe's story forced me to face the mystery of life in a transformational way this past year. Timely, too, as we navigated the uncertainty of COVID. And today, when my old demands for certainty rear their head, Joe's exhortation to embrace the mystery, hard won from his literal life-after-death experience, rings loud and clear in my heart, and I'm able to surrender my demands for certainty, embrace the mystery, and keep moving forward. Sometimes better than others, of course, but this has been an invaluable gift to me. What's your relationship with life's mystery like? Next up, takeaway number 3, which I'm calling Let It Die, from a fascinating conversation I had with my friend and colleague, Rick Kahn. I listened to this episode no less than 4 times in the week following production because it was so impactful for me. Rick Kahn is an outstanding executive coach for companies whose products and services we all use every day. His road from dyslexic middle child, high school dropout, globe-trotting spiritual seeker, and high-end custom home builder to the life he lives today based out of a quaint seaside town in Mexico is fascinating at face value. But add to that storyline 2 mind-blowing encounters with mortality separated by 30 years, and you've got a tale that's packed full of extraordinary lessons and wisdom for all of us. In episode 13, Rick showed us how life is a series of necessary deaths that lead to fuller life before we depart planet Earth. Here's Rick in his own words.
About that time, I had the death of a business. As 2008, pretty much 2009, as the collapse happened, the Great Recession, my construction company evaporated after 20-some years. Heavily invested in residential development. It was the perfect storm for a lot of us. That's just another form of death. I love how you said the word holding on and letting go. And man, life is just a series of that. And the tighter we hold on to things, the more constricted we are, and the looser we are with the reins. You asked your listeners as parents just to lighten up on the reins a bit of expectation. And so I loved how you talked about holding on, letting go. And so letting go is death. And so I let go of a big part of my identity as a builder, and I moved to Mexico. A lot of it was as a economic refugee. Most of us who came down south here at that time will describe ourselves as that. There were people in technology business, all kinds of people that were business people that came down here and figured, I'm going to figure it out, but I don't need to be under that much financial pressure in the States. And I've seen so many of my friends reinvent themselves to great degrees of success over the last dozen years. And so that's a sense of dying, letting go of something. If you can let go, truly let go, something else is birthed through that.
Sometimes we hold on to something well beyond its useful purpose in our lives, and it holds us back from moving on to better things. Not to be too morbid, but it's like trying to take our dead dog out for a walk for days and weeks, even years after it's passed away. That's obviously nonsensical, but we do that in ways that are less obviously nonsensical in our lives every day. My relationship with soccer was that way, and in Rick's episode, I share how finally letting soccer die in my life allowed new and better things to come to life. What do you need to finally let die so that something new and better can come to life? Moving on to takeaway number 4, there's love beneath the waves. From my friend Matt Wilkes' harrowing 7-year story of Job-like suffering. Matt Wilkes is a physical therapist by trade who today serves as VP and Chief Rehabilitation Officer for Sheltering Arms Institute, a cutting-edge inpatient rehabilitation hospital in Richmond, Virginia. The story Matt shared in episode 20 is a first-hand report from the front lines of 7 years of suffering. It's absolutely heart-wrenching stuff. He invited us into the darkest moments, his own dark night of the soul, the triumphant moments, and much more in between, to help us connect more powerfully with what matters most in life and what it's all about. In his modern-day story, we find ancient wisdom for living our most fulfilling and meaningful lives as humans on planet Earth. Here in his own words, Matt shares how his dark night of the soul led him to discover that there's love beneath the waves.
For anybody that's ever dealt with cancer, you have my deepest sympathies. There's this mental gymnastic thing that happens. You try to convince yourself that it's going to be okay, or you start playing the scenario of odds, or you bargain with God, or you bargain with whatever it is that that you think will comfort you in some way, like give you succor to be able to just go on in a rational way. At some point, for me, all that rational thought came to an end, and I realized there's nothing solid to hold on to. There's no grip on reality. And so I was faced with a choice of, do I try to essentially manufacture that for myself? This will be a little hard to understand, but I was faced with a choice of, I can wake my wife up, inflict all of my anxiety upon her, but I knew that she was not what I needed. She could not help me. Waking her up would only spread the anxiety. She could not provide an answer. It's going to be okay, right? We've had people tell us that and no, you can't say that. It's not true. I don't know that it's going to be okay. She wouldn't have known that it was going to be okay. So instead, I laid there in the dark. It's like the wee hours of the morning, I don't know, 2, 3, 4. And for hours, all I could do was breathe. And even that, barely so. And I would continually was like grasping for what is solid, what is sure. And there was nothing. There was absolutely nothing except the Lord. In that moment, I had an experience where, this will sound strange, I did not hear a voice, I didn't, but I had a sense of the only sure thing was God's presence allowing me to take the next breath and nothing more. And it felt horrible. Just absolutely undoing. Like I could not have existed for much longer in that. But in those moments, in those hours before the sun came up the next day, for which I was awake the entire time, God's presence was so real that reality has sort of sustained over time to know that there is love underneath the waves, that God does not leave his people to suffer alone.
My own journey in life has been permeated by a pretty strong sense of loneliness. Aloneness might be a better word, actually. The anxiety I've known my whole life creates a sense of separation and isolation from others and the world around me because the war is waged internally. It's invisible to others, but it's a very, very real and often very painful thing for me. That contributes a lot to the aloneness. I've also experienced a persistent sense of separation and disapproval from God, someone to whom Matt and I both would give credit for our existence, and with whom we one day hope to be reunited in perfection. I'm not saying, by the way, that I'm actually separated from God or disapproved of by him, but rather that this has been a troublesome, ongoing internal struggle for me. And that, too, has created a long-standing and painful sense of aloneness, and a sense that it's all riding on my shoulders, on this or that decision in this moment, etc. So, for Matt to have plumbed the depths of despair in his dark night of the soul, and discovered that when all else is stripped away, there's still love beneath the waves, well, that's a gift of immeasurable value for me, both in being able to know that without going through the suffering that Matt has endured, and in the actual knowledge that underneath it all, God is there sustaining me. I'm so grateful for that gift, made possible by Matt's courageous vulnerability in sharing his story. When you look beneath the waves, what do you find? Takeaway number 5 came together courtesy of my most recent guest and friend, 25-year fire service veteran Tony Gonzalez, in episode 23. I call this takeaway, "There's magic in the mundane." And it's also a takeaway that in one way or another, every guest on the podcast has emphasized in their own way. That makes this one an all caps, bolded, underscored, italicized takeaway. Whatever we call it, it's one of the biggies that's emerged from almost a year of these conversations with people whose encounters with mortality radically changed their lives. When harrowing encounters with death are a routine part of your job, how does it change the way you live? Tony Gonzalez helped us answer that question and put the lessons he's learned to work in our lives right now. Tony retired in 2017 as one of 8 battalion chiefs for the city of Denver. His peers and colleagues scratched their heads in disbelief when he made the decision to retire. It's far from the norm to exit the fire service at that point in your career. But Tony's many encounters with mortality as a firefighter, one in particular that he shares in the interview, and others in his personal life, had led him to dramatically reevaluate things. And he left the fire service behind at the peak of his career to double down on what matters most to him. He's never looked back. Here's Tony sharing what he's learned from being present with his family now more than ever before. What has it been like to be home?
I just really enjoy the mundane, bland part of life. I love going to the grocery store. Prime example, Diego, my youngest, is in Winter Sports Club. Well, they're both in Winter Sports Club, but Diego's in it quite more than Cruz. But every time I go to pick him up, small thing, I love to go drop him off, pick him up from skiing, hear how it was, how his practice was. Every single time I go to pick him up, when I go to grab his skis, he's like, "Dad, can we go ski together? Can we go ski together?" Well, I never have my ski stuff on because I'm cooking dinner or I'm working, and I pick him up in between, webinars.
Just got done shooting the firefighter calendar for 2021.
I did that too. Yeah, well, the older fat guy with less hair calendar for sure. Tonight, I'm going to make sure that I'm in my boots and ski gear because I know he's going to come down off his final run and he will look at me and go, "Yes, we got to go ski together."
Nice.
So it's those kind of things. It's just simple stuff that I was never around for.
Tony's reminder, added to essentially the same exhortation from every other guest on this show so far, has helped me a ton. I can tend to get caught up in the big picture, ideals, and the world of ideas. Persistently pursue a better future at the expense of the beauty that's right here, right now. To minimize the mundane in my zeal for what could be. But now, the mundane has a special place in my heart and life. Wrestling and roughhousing with my 8-year-old, taking shooting lessons with my 11-year-old, running around town, doing simple errands with my wife, just passing time together without a specific purpose or objective in mind. I see the magic in those mundane moments now better than ever before. I have Tony and all the guests who preceded him to thank for that change. How much room do you make in your life for the magically mundane stuff of life? So there you have it. 5 of my big takeaways from nearly a year of conversations with ordinary people who've had extraordinary encounters with mortality. What have a few of your big takeaways been? I want to publicly thank my guests, heroes in my eyes, for the courage it took to share their stories. And I want to thank you for tuning in, taking to heart what you hear, and living with more guts, gusto, and abandon. I also want to ask for your help. If this podcast has helped you, would you help spread the word? Share an episode that was especially meaningful to you with just one other person, and ask them to consider doing the same. It's time for more of us to become the people we were made to be and live the lives we were made to live. Remember, you are going to die, but you're not dead yet. So get after it. My purpose as a coach is to help you live the life you know you are made to live, with guts, gusto, and abandon. Connect with me on Facebook or Instagram at Andrew Petty Coach, or email me at andrew@digdeepwinbig.com. To learn about Graveyard Group Masterminds, where we make time each week to invest in your life's most important work, visit digdeepwinbig.com/The Graveyard Group. I'm so glad you tuned in today. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next time on Andrew Petty is Dying.